Love is the first and most essential bond, but it's also the invisible thread, woven with time, attention, and tenderness through consistent nurturing relationships.
Princess Catherine had prepared herself for difficult conversations before, but nothing could have prepared her for what Princess Anne was about to say. Behind a closed door, with no aides and no cameras, Anne revealed the final private confession Queen Elizabeth had entrusted to her before her death. Catherine listened in stunned silence. Then came the words that shattered her composure, because the late Queen had spoken directly about Catherine, William, Camilla, and the survival of the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had summoned Catherine to Windsor after a tense gathering, offering no explanation. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, told her only that the matter concerned something Elizabeth had kept from the wider family. Catherine sensed the seriousness immediately. Anne did not speak like someone sharing gossip. She spoke like someone finally laying down a burden carried for years. Anne explained how, during one of her final private conversations with her mother, Elizabeth had made her promise to keep one confession sealed until Catherine was strong enough to hear it. Anne had documented that conversation afterward, preserving the Queen's words. Then she said it plainly. The late monarch believed Catherine had become essential to protecting William and the future crown, and she feared Camilla's growing influence around Charles could place unbearable pressure on Catherine and fracture the next generation. Catherine did not answer. Her hands tightened. Her breathing changed. When Anne repeated that Elizabeth had worried specifically about what she might one day endure, the Princess of Wales lowered her head and began to cry. She had survived scrutiny, expectation, and years of pressure, but hearing that the Queen had seen the danger before Catherine admitted it made the confession almost impossible to absorb. Catherine finally asked whether Elizabeth truly believed the family could turn against her. Anne refused to soften the truth. The monarch had not feared dramatic betrayal. She feared something slower: rivalry, whispered influence, emotional exhaustion, and years of pressure strong enough to isolate Catherine from William. That was why Elizabeth had instructed Anne to protect them both, if palace loyalties ever threatened their household. Catherine wiped her tears and looked at Anne. What happened that made her fear Camilla that much? Anne's expression changed. The answer, she said, went back to a Windsor evening the family had tried to bury. Catherine had heard the Queen's warning, but before she could understand why Elizabeth had made it, she first had to confront the uncomfortable truth about everyone standing at the center of it. The confession was devastating because it touched 4 people whose futures were already dangerously intertwined. Catherine carried the expectations of a future queen. William carried the crown waiting for him. Charles carried the authority of the reigning monarch. And Camilla possessed something less visible but equally powerful: proximity to the king. Elizabeth had understood those competing pressures long before anyone else admitted them, and Anne's revelation suddenly forced Catherine to see her own family through the late Queen's eyes. Anne watched her carefully as the tears settled into silence. In that private conversation, Catherine admitted that the confession frightened her because it proved the Queen had seen wounds she had tried to hide. The Princess of Wales, the title carried by the wife of the heir to the throne, had spent years mastering calm for the sake of her children and for William. She protected her children from the strain of royal life, and she protected her husband from burdens he already carried. Yet Anne could see that restraint had come at a cost. William felt the change the moment he saw her. He noticed the swollen eyes, the clipped answers, and the silence that did not belong to the woman he knew best. When she told him Anne had shared something from his grandmother's documented account of her final wishes, the Prince of Wales, the title held by the heir to the throne, went still. His fear was immediate. Any threat to Catherine touched his marriage, his children, and the future crown. Any shadow over Charles or Camilla also threatened the balance of the family he was expected to lead one day. Charles knew nothing yet, and that ignorance mattered. The king, meaning the reigning sovereign who holds the monarchy's present authority, was still moving through his duties unaware that Anne had finally passed on Elizabeth's warning. That secrecy gave the confession its danger. It did not accuse him outright, but it questioned the influence surrounding his household. Catherine understood that too. The late monarch had not spoken about pressure in general. She had named Camilla. That made the warning sharper, more personal, and far harder for the princess to dismiss as old family anxiety. William refused to let fragments rule their lives. He told Catherine he wanted every word Anne remembered and every detail preserved in that private account. She agreed, though fear still gripped her, because the truth had already changed them. Anne would now have to take them back to the moment everything shifted. To understand why the Queen had become alarmed, they would have to return to the night when a royal disagreement inside Windsor crossed a line Elizabeth never forgot. Every family crisis has a moment that looks small when it happens, and enormous in hindsight. For Queen Elizabeth, that moment came during a private gathering at Windsor, months before her final decline. There were no shouting headlines and no public rupture. Just one conversation, one intervention, and one silence that lasted too long. Anne now tells Catherine that what happened that evening permanently altered the monarch's judgment, and transformed a vague concern into a private warning about the future of the crown. Anne remembered the tension long before anyone admitted it existed. Elizabeth had watched William and Catherine take on heavier responsibilities while trying to build their own household with greater independence. A royal household, the private team and structure supporting a senior member of the family, was more than staff and schedules. It shaped influence, access, and daily decision-making. The Queen believed the younger couple needed room to grow into their future roles, without every choice being filtered through Charles or Camilla. Camilla's influence had been expanding quietly, as Charles assumed more duties on his mother's behalf. She became increasingly present in conversations about engagements, family priorities, and the way the next generation should be prepared. Elizabeth noticed. Anne tells Catherine that the monarch did not object to Camilla supporting her husband, but she became uneasy when that support began touching decisions that belonged to William and Catherine alone. The concern finally exploded during one private Windsor dinner. Catherine remembered that evening immediately. Camilla had pressed Charles to challenge her over George's future royal preparation, arguing that William and his wife were becoming too independent from the king's future household. The discussion was not about affection, it was about control. Catherine answered calmly, but she refused to give ground. George was her son before he was an heir, and she would not allow family strategy to erase parental judgment. Across the table, Elizabeth watched every word land. William finally intervened. He placed his hand flat on the table and told Charles, in a voice far firmer than anyone expected, that decisions concerning his children would be made by him and Catherine. The room fell silent. Camilla did not answer immediately. Charles looked stunned. The future king had drawn a boundary, and everyone present understood that it was not temporary. Anne says the real turning point came later. Elizabeth asked her daughter to remain behind after the others had gone, and Anne later recorded the substance of that private conversation in a written account for herself. The Queen said Camilla's intervention had exposed something dangerous. Personal influence was beginning to cross into matters affecting the next reign. She feared Catherine would one day be trapped between William's loyalty to his wife and Charles's loyalty to his own household. What Catherine had first heard as a dead queen's warning now became something far more immediate. And once William learned exactly what happened that night, restraint gave way to confrontation. William did not storm into the room shouting. That would have been easier. Instead, he entered with Catherine beside him, closed the door behind them, and asked Anne to repeat every word. The prince listened without interrupting as his aunt described Elizabeth's fears, the Windsor dinner, and the promise she had carried ever since. When Anne finished, William remained perfectly still. Then he turned toward Catherine, and what he saw on her face ended any possibility of letting the matter quietly disappear. William had insisted on absolute privacy. No secretaries, advisors, or household staff were present, because he wanted the confession protected from palace interpretation before he made a decision. Anne understood why. A royal household, the private team that manages a senior royal's duties, access, and daily affairs, could turn a family concern into an institutional crisis within hours. She repeated Elizabeth's warning carefully. Catherine was central to William's future stability, and any effort to isolate or overrule her could eventually weaken him as well. William looked directly at Catherine and asked why she had never told him how deeply the Windsor dinner had hurt her. She hesitated, then gave him the answer she had buried for too long. Catherine feared that speaking openly would force him into an impossible choice between defending his wife and confronting Charles. The prince's anger shifted instantly. He was no longer furious only about what had happened. He was shaken that she had carried the pain alone because she believed protecting him required silence. Catherine held his gaze. "I could survive being disliked. I could not survive becoming the reason you lost your father." The words stopped him cold. William had expected anger, perhaps resentment, but not that. She had endured the pressure because she feared damaging his relationship with the king. That realization cut deeper than any accusation could have done. Anne refused to let emotion turn into recklessness. She told William that protecting Catherine did not require declaring war on Charles. It required something harder, refusing to let silence become permission. Then she shared another detail from her documented account of Elizabeth's final conversation. The Queen believed William's greatest weakness would never be rage. It would be his instinct to absorb conflict privately until the damage became too deep to repair. William pushed his chair back and stood. Catherine knew what was coming before he spoke. He would go directly to Charles, alone, and he would demand clarity before anyone else became involved. William was prepared to confront his father, but the real battle would not be about one old argument. It would be about who held influence over the monarchy's next generation. Royal power is rarely exercised through dramatic declarations alone. It moves through access, timing, proximity, trust, and the ability to shape what reaches the sovereign before anyone else enters the room. Elizabeth understood that. Anne understood it too. And now William was beginning to see why his grandmother had been so uneasy. The question was no longer whether Camilla possessed influence. The question was whether that influence had begun reaching into territory William considered his alone to protect. Charles still held the authority of the reigning monarch, and William knew that mattered. The royal household, the network of staff and advisors who managed the sovereign's official and private duties, ultimately answered to the king. The prince could not simply overrule his father because he disliked the influence around him. Yet his own position carried a different power. Catherine's future role, the direction of their household, and the upbringing of George, Charlotte, and Louis belonged to the next generation Charles would one day leave behind. Charles sensed trouble before William even arrived. An aide approached quietly and told him his son wanted a private meeting. The king stopped reading, removed his glasses, and asked one question: would Catherine be present? When the answer came back no, his expression tightened. He understood immediately that this was not a social visit. William was coming as a son, but also as the man expected to inherit everything his father now carried. Catherine remained with Anne and admitted what frightened her most. She feared Elizabeth's confession could become the very thing the late queen had wanted to prevent: another fracture inside the family. Anne listened, then shared a deeper instruction preserved in her written account of that final conversation. Elizabeth had told her that if William's household ever became entangled with the king's personal relationships, she was to stand beside Catherine and the prince openly if necessary. Camilla felt the shift as well. She noticed Charles had been drawn into a private conversation involving William and Anne, yet no one had explained why. The queen consort asked a senior aide what had happened, and received an unusually careful answer. That hesitation told her more than words could. Something important had moved beyond her reach. Charles learned the truth moments before William arrived. Elizabeth's final confession had been disclosed, and his mother's warning had placed Camilla's influence at the center of a family fault line. The king now faced a choice he could no longer postpone: defend his wife without qualification, or admit that his mother's fear had touched something real. The confession had moved from Anne's memory into the king's household, and once Charles understood what his mother had said, the first consequences began almost immediately. There was no public announcement, no statement from Buckingham Palace. Yet inside the family, everything changed within hours. Charles now knew that Elizabeth had questioned the influence surrounding him. William knew his grandmother had feared for Catherine. Camilla knew her name had been spoken in a conversation she could not control. And Catherine, still struggling with the confession itself, began to understand that the most painful consequence was not anger. It was the sudden disappearance of trust. Charles remained alone after the confrontation. He walked toward the window, returned to his desk, and picked up a pen without using it. Buckingham Palace, the monarch's principal official residence and the administrative heart of the royal household, continued around him, but the king could not simply return to routine. His mother's warning had reached him from beyond the years he thought were settled, and worse, It challenged the judgment he had defended for so long. William had made his boundary unmistakable. Decisions concerning Catherine's role, their children, and the future preparation of George would no longer pass through informal family conversations. Any concern would come directly to him and his wife. Charles resisted the implication immediately. He told his son that Elizabeth's fears could not become a permanent verdict on his marriage. Yet the prince noticed something unexpected beneath the anger. His father sounded wounded, not defiant. Charles finally admitted what William had not expected to hear. The Windsor dinner had gone too far. He should have stopped the conversation when Camilla began pressing Catherine over George. The king did not abandon his wife, but he acknowledged that silence had allowed private influence to cross a line. For William, that admission mattered because it proved the conflict was not invented by Anne's account. His father remembered the same moment. Camilla faced the consequence soon afterward. Charles told her she would step back from discussions involving William and Catherine's household. She remained silent before asking whether this was truly his decision or Elizabeth's final command reaching beyond the grave. The queen consort felt the sting immediately. The restriction did not remove her from Charles's life, but it placed a boundary around an area where she had once spoken freely. Catherine felt guilt before relief. When William returned, she saw the exhaustion in him and began apologizing for what the confession had caused. He stopped her. The fracture had existed before Anne ever spoke, he said, and silence had only hidden it. Catherine then made the choice no one expected. She wanted to speak to Charles herself, without William between them. The prince hesitated, but she refused protection this time. Catherine had broken down when she first heard Elizabeth's confession. Now she intended to face the man most wounded by it, alone. There were no advisors in the room when Catherine sat down opposite Charles. No William, no Anne, no Camilla. Just a father-in-law, a daughter-in-law, and the shadow of a woman whose final words had unsettled them both. Catherine had every reason to accuse him. Charles had every reason to defend himself. Instead, something unexpected happened. The confrontation William feared became a confession of another kind, and for the first time, both of them admitted what the years of royal pressure had cost. Catherine had asked for this meeting herself. She told William that Charles needed to hear her without assuming every sentence carried his son's anger behind it. The prince hesitated, but he agreed. A private audience, simply a closed meeting with a senior royal and no wider household present, gave her the one thing she needed: space to speak without anyone translating her pain into strategy. William let her go, though his concern remained impossible to hide. Charles began carefully but defensively. He told Catherine that Elizabeth's fears belonged to a particular period and should not become a permanent judgment against Camilla. The king insisted that his marriage could not be reduced to one Windsor argument or one warning preserved in Anne's account. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she answered with something he had not expected. Catherine said she did not want Camilla punished. Her voice faltered as she explained that the confession had broken her for a different reason. Elizabeth had apparently seen how frightened she once felt, even when Catherine herself had refused to admit it. The pain came from realizing that the queen understood the pressure before Catherine found the courage to name it. Charles looked down. "You should never have believed you had to endure that alone." She struggled to answer, because for once his acknowledgement carried no excuse behind it. Catherine then drew the boundary plainly. She would respect Charles's marriage, but her own marriage and children could never become negotiating ground inside that relationship. The king accepted the distinction. He admitted that competing loyalties around him had blurred, and that Elizabeth's warning hurt because his mother had seen one danger correctly. He had allowed silence to make interference seem acceptable. Charles made a decision. He would speak to Camilla himself and reinforce the boundary without humiliating her. Then he asked Catherine something she had not expected. Would she stand beside him publicly at the next major engagement? She understood what the invitation meant. It was not ceremony. It was reassurance. The family had reached its private turning point. Now the world outside the palace was about to see the first visible sign that something profound had changed. By the following morning, the confession remained officially private, but the change inside the family was suddenly visible. Catherine appeared beside Charles at Windsor, with William and Anne nearby, composed once more after the tears that had shaken her days earlier. The public knew nothing of the conversation behind closed doors, yet one photograph captured the new balance instantly. Catherine was no longer standing behind the senior generation. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with the king. Charles had already approved a quiet change inside the household. Matters involving William and Catherine would now move directly between the three of them, rather than through informal intermediaries. St. George's Chapel, the historic royal chapel inside Windsor Castle, used for major services and family ceremonies, became the setting where that new understanding first appeared in public. Anne urged everyone to resist triumph. Elizabeth's confession, she reminded Catherine, had been intended to prevent division, not create winners and losers. Charles paused before entering the chapel and turned toward Catherine. Instead of moving ahead while she followed several steps behind, the king allowed her to walk beside him. Cameras caught the moment instantly. William remained close, watching his wife carefully, while Anne stayed nearby with the calm restraint that had defined her role from the beginning. The image spread through royal coverage because it carried a simple message. Whatever tension had shaken the family privately, Catherine was not being pushed aside. Catherine heard spectators calling her name outside Windsor and briefly squeezed William's hand. The gesture lasted only a moment, but he understood it immediately. Her composure was costing her more than anyone watching could know. She had broken down after hearing Anne's documented account, confronted Charles directly, and now had to stand before the public as though nothing inside her had been shaken. William stayed close, giving her the quiet support Elizabeth had believed would matter most. Camilla followed the new boundary without confrontation. During an exchange involving Charles and the Waleses, she did not step in or redirect the conversation. The Queen Consort remained beside her husband during her own part of the engagement, accepting the separation between her role and the decisions surrounding William's family. By morning, one national newspaper carried the Windsor image across its front page beneath the headline, "Together at Windsor," presenting the moment as a display of unity after visible strain. Anne later found Catherine alone and told her there was still one part of Elizabeth's confession she had misunderstood. The Queen had never wanted those final words remembered merely as a warning about Camilla. The public saw reconciliation. Catherine was about to learn that Elizabeth's final message had never truly been about fear. It had been about faith. Catherine had spent days hearing Elizabeth's confession as a warning. Beware of influence. Protect William. Guard the children. Never allow pressure to fracture the next reign. But Anne now gave her the part that changed everything. The late Queen had not spoken about Catherine because she believed her weak. She had spoken because she believed Catherine possessed the strength to hold a future king, a young family, and an ancient institution together, without losing the humanity beneath the crown. Anne completed the confession in a private conversation, drawing from the written account she kept. Elizabeth's deepest fear had never been Camilla alone. The monarch feared any force, family pressure, royal expectation, ambition, or influence, that could pull William and Catherine apart. That mattered because a future king, isolated from the person he trusted most, could carry that fracture into everything he was expected to lead. Catherine felt the meaning change inside her. The tears returned, but they no longer came from shock. They came from recognition. Elizabeth had seen her strength and hidden fear. The Queen believed Catherine's greatest contribution would not be a title, ceremony, or public approval. It would be giving William something monarchy could never create for him: a secure private center where duty could end and trust could begin. William listened when Catherine told him the complete meaning of Anne's account. He took her hand and admitted that his grandmother had understood their marriage more clearly than he realized. The prince no longer spoke about enemies or sides. He understood that Elizabeth's warning had never asked him to choose between people. It had asked him to protect the bond that would carry him through becoming king. Charles kept the boundary he had accepted. He did not humiliate Camilla, and she accepted that William and Catherine's household would develop independently. The king recognized where personal loyalties had blurred into family authority, while the Queen Consort stepped back from decisions that did not belong to her. Anne finally released the promise she had carried since Elizabeth's death. She had waited because truth used too early could wound, but truth withheld too long could destroy. Catherine's breakdown was not the collapse of a future queen. It was the moment hidden pressure became clarity. Elizabeth's last confession pushed Charles to acknowledge limits, William to defend his family, Camilla to accept boundaries, and Catherine to understand the extraordinary faith the late monarch had placed in her. What began as a warning ended as protection. The family emerged far more honest, defined, and united than before. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.